For sure.
All right, everyone, welcome. Hi, I'm Karen Tongson. I'm the director of the Consortium for Gender, Sexuality, Race, and Public Culture. And I'm pleased to invite everyone and welcome everyone here today to our inaugural intergenerational dialogue series. And the purpose of this series is to bring authors, eminent authors, into conversation with USC graduate students who work in similar fields or have overlapping research interests. And both Joshua Gavier Guzmán and Ethan Trejo were kind enough to launch this series for us. By way of brief introduction, I want to introduce us to our guest author today, Joshua Gavier Guzmán, who is Associate Professor and Vice Chair in the Department of Gender Studies at UCLA. He is obviously the author of Dissatisfactions, which we'll be talking about today, so I won't go into depth describing it for you. He's also fairly recently become the editor-in-chief of Aztlán. Josh's work, I've loved sort of seeing it evolve over a period of time that we've known each other since he was himself a graduate student many years ago. And the engaging like space, affect, performance, Chicano Latino studies, different ways of rethinking border imaginaries that are not romanticized, et cetera. So I'm really excited to hear what will be drawn out in this conversation today. Of course, our interlocutor is Ethan Trejo, a Ph.D. candidate in USC's Department of English, and his scholarship is situated in queer and Latinx studies with particular interest in performance studies, drag studies, AIDS studies, queer of color critique, queer literature, and US Latino literature. His dissertation examines the political dimensions of Latinx drag aesthetics and performance, and also Ethan, I know, has been in, is it multiple productions of In the Heights?
One.
Anyway, at least one, but it felt like it gave in so many different ways. Anyway, please welcome Professor Guzmán and Ethan Trejo.
Great, thank you so much to Karen for having us. I think I told you the first time that we met that I had been a fan of your work, like your edited the special issue that you did with Cristina Leon in Women of Performance, your essay in Aztlán on Selena's voice, really influential work that have helped me think about the way that I conceptualize queerness, Latinidad, particularly in its kind of performative dimensions. So it is a gift to be in conversation with you today. So I think maybe for those who are not as familiar with the book, maybe just a brief overview of the book.
Yeah, and hi everyone. I want to thank Ethan for being in dialogue with me, Karen for the invitation, Sam for all the help with logistics, and it's good to meet you. So being Vice Chair of Gender Studies, also the role is actually to be graduate director. So I have been Vice Chair for 5 years. I take graduate education and training very seriously, mostly because I had really good mentors in graduate school, mentors that also introduced me to, at that time, young, as an assistant. I think like assistant, that's what I mean, like a junior, I should say, scholar, and scholars like Karen. And so I do think graduate education is really, really, really important. So I'm tailoring all these answers to you all, basically. So in terms of the overview of the book, I was really swayed with this idea of negative affects or feelings in graduate school, and particularly how they were related to sort of post-Fordist economy, and how that period also overlapped with the AIDS crisis. And so I was really into trying to find a way to push against identity politics or identitarian sort of leaning art in Chicano Latino studies. And I think, focusing on negative affects and style, the way we kind of aestheticize certain politics was the avenues that I wanted to go down and tell that story. But I know we're gonna ask a lot of questions about the nitty-gritty of the book, but I guess the big thing to take away is really turned off by how at the time the field was really marred with positive feelings, even joy is still around and lurking, and like affirmative representation of Chicano or Latino identity. And I just, kind of being a punk myself, wanted to do the opposite. And so, yeah, that's what the book is a response of trying to do the opposite of what I think the field was legislating at the time to do.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think there's a couple threads there definitely to pull out the sort of punk ethos that runs through your work, and particularly through the book, the sort of intervening in the conversation around positive affects and the sort of rise of negatives, like negative affects, negative performances that your book is definitely part of that sort of oeuvre that's been like rising in queer Latinx studies. But maybe you can, before we get to those, maybe speak about the process of dissertation to book, since we have a couple of graduate students, myself included, and what sort of really drove the project, particularly because you were in New York at the time, but the book very much centers in LA.
Yeah, 100%. So in graduate school, I worked with Jose Munoz, and he sat me down, and after he refused to grade a graduate seminar paper that I wrote for his seminar on aesthetics and politics, and it was the first grad seminar with him that I was taking, and it was the midterm paper, so my first time showing something, writing to him, and I just didn't know what to write about, because I came from Georgetown undergrad education. I was going to be like a foreign service officer, LOL. I was like going, going to politics, and I was kind of nerdy like that. And then there was a trajectory change, and that involved meeting him, Jose Munoz and stuff. So, mind you, so I was just like a politico at that time. I didn't know a lot about art, let alone performance. So the first seminar paper that I wrote about was on Our Town, Thornton Wilder, yeah. So,
which I've also been in.
Oh my God. We could talk about that. I should have written about that.
There we go.
Okay, let's see. But anyway, if you know it, it's crusty, right? Old play. So Jose read that, was really shocked, and refused to grade it, and called me into his office. He was like, "Look, I know you're good with theory, you're a good writer, but why'd you write about this?" I was like, "Well, I don't know like anything about art, whatever." He was like, "Do you like being in New York?" And I was like, "Yeah." He was like, "Then go out and get a sense of the world." He was like, "Do you know this performance group, Aztlán?" And I'm like, "No, what?" He's like, "Go look them up." And that was it. And that was the beginning of the research project, because then I went to go look up Aztlán, the Chicano performance art group that's in the book. It's the cover of this book. And from there, I just pulled on those strings and found this whole network of artists in Los Angeles, and then I was interested in the period and their style. I thought they looked so cool, so that was sort of the beginning of that project. And so I was like, you know what, I do want to write on this scene, and I would joke at the time that the only way you could write about LA is to be in New York, and at least to get it on the page. And then having moved here, obviously, and lived here for some time, the dissertation changed completely as it became a manuscript, a monograph. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I also thought I was going to go into some sort of political career. I entered college as a political science major, thinking I was going to be a lawyer. Clearly did not work out. I think there's a lot of ways when, maybe we are politically minded but find ourselves, gravitating towards aesthetics, literature, the sort of beauty around cultural production. But I think there's something really interesting about being in a very urban epicenter such as New York, LA, an epicenter of cultural production, a very much an enclave of Latinx peoples, and sort of really finding our way through it, and just going out into the city and just sensing what sort of queerness and Latinidad sort of runs through the city, both historically and contemporarily, I think is really interesting in thinking through the sort of situatedness in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and once I moved to, even not before that, when I started interviewing folks like Gronk or Harry Gamboa from OSCO, I quickly got a sense that Chicanos or like, Mexican Americans from Los Angeles were very different from Mexican Americans from South Texas, which is where I'm from. And one of the major differences is like turf or neighborhood centered way of thinking. So this whole idea of like, this is Los Angeles, I've been here for a very long time. You need to get to know the community. Like that was the difficulty actually in writing the dissertation, was gaining trust from the artists that I was writing about, because everyone just felt like, who are these people just coming in, writing about us, telling our history, you have to get to know us, get to know the community. And so I really, was honoring that as a graduate student writing the dissertation, and but more so obviously when I moved here, and that's when the sort of argument completely changed too. So it was, there is a queer sensibility in the sense of like, I don't really feel like I belong anywhere. So the idea of ownership by virtue of like where you're from was always weird to me. But I respected it, and I learned that from doing this project too, from a group of artists in LA.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because I am from LA, I'm from the LA area, I've been here for my entire life, and I think that definitely has influenced sort of my sense, the kind of objects that I'm drawn towards, the people I'm drawn towards. And for instance, I think there's something really important about LA drag in relation to Latinidad that it needs to be sort of teased out in relation to the broader histories around Latinxes within LA, the sort of rootedness of, like, say, Chicanidad in LA and what that sort of means. But I think, that sort of personal sensibility that you were speaking of definitely runs through the book. Can we talk a little bit about the periodization and how that's sort of like impacted, like why start and end in this period?
It's a really great question. So in undergrad, I was also part of MECHA, the Georgetown, so we all know what MECHA is, the Chicano student group. And I was there all 4 years, and those were my friends, and I, was like a student activist, and we fought for the first LGBTQ resource center at a Catholic university, and all this under the banner of MECHA. And so I was really familiar with like Chicano student activism, the history, et cetera. But as I was like doing research on OSCO and then discovering musicians like Alice Bag or Teresa Covarrubias from the Brat, these punk Chicanas, the first thing that struck me was like they didn't really look like they would have fit into MECHA. And then I started getting confused. I was like, wait, but are they still political or activisty? Because I had my little activisty brain from undergrad going into starting to research this. And there's this really interesting story that Alice Bag tells in her memoir, where she was at the Chicano Moratorium March in 1970, where there was, the police brutality. There was a march against the war in Vietnam, and then LAPD sort of beat up a lot of people, right, and killed Ruben Salazar, the Chicano LA Times journalist. And she witnessed all that, and so that's actually what politicized her, and she wanted to join MECHA, but she was already like kind of a glam freak, as she called herself. She was a huge fan of Elton John. She would just make her own clothes. She wore weird makeup, as she would say. She looked like a freak. And when she went to the MECHA table to sign up, the machistas just sort of rejected her because they said that, like, you don't look like that you care about the movement, right? And she was like, what do you mean? She's like, you are not, like, look at what you're wearing. And they kind of judged her based on her style. And I thought that was really interesting, because the question then of like, how does one look like an activist, or how does one look political, was really interesting to me. And so that's how the question of style came to the center of the book. How does one stylize their politics?
Yeah, and that's really core to the book as well, this sort of sense that one there's a lot of ambivalence, there's a lot of in-betweenness that runs through the book when they're, like in the case of Alice Baggs, or as well as with your examination of Asco, this sort of sense that one is ostracized from the majoritarian sphere, but also like the minoritarian sphere has created this sort of like normative, hegemonic sort of form of how one is supposed to behave, one is supposed to perform, one is supposed to look, that really creates this really interesting way to work with that sort of ambivalence that is partially also really core to, say, disidentification and the sort of negotiation between various social spheres and social realms that one has to go through that really pay attention to the fraughtness of identity that I think is really one of the major sort of really interesting points in the book. Yeah.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's a project about identity and difference and obviously their relation. It's also a project of the tension between an individual and their community, which we could call politics. I think to relate it to disidentifications, which is absolutely on point, this was also the time of Cruising Utopia by Jose Munoz, right? So everyone was quoting Cruising Utopia left and right during this time, especially after he passed, and like that was the book. And I always felt that people like misunderstood or misread that argument to mean that we should always just be looking to the horizon or everything's future possibility or future dawning. It's a dialectical argument because it starts with being dissatisfied with the here and now. That's why queer subjects look to the past or to history to sift out these concrete utopias to then perhaps imagine or chart other ways of being in the world. But I wanted to freeze frame that dialectical argument on the first step, which is the critique of the here and now, to be dissatisfied. And so this book is like a sort of like a gesture to disidentifications to the extent that, you know, it is about understanding how the future is figured as first as lost in the here and now. That's why we feel dissatisfied with the status quo. And so it was looking to chart how folks understand or interrogate that loss of the future in the here and now, which you know is stylized politically as, I don't know, the four affects that I was interested in. Although one's an aesthetic, lo-fi is an aesthetic attitude, but nausea, ambivalence, and malaise definitely are sort of these responses to this time period. So post-68, right? The Chicano Moratorium March, 1968 being sort of this hot, you know, political year around the globe. The 70s as a decade being understood as subversive, the subversive 70s, the rise of Black power, Chicano power, gay liberation, the feminist movement, these things, you know, were political movements, you know, based on sort of some identity banners, and they did a lot of good work. But it's also a time of like the rise of a particular subculture that I was really interested in, which is like the punk subculture. So for me, I was interested in like how you got folks who were really politically invested in sort of resisting and critiquing the status quo, and then you had other folks who were punk who were just sort of like had their own mode of refusal, but that was definitely more aestheticized, more sort of queer in the sense that there was no one identity that owned the punk community. In fact, it was a hodgepodge of folks that just felt different. And so I wanted to chart those two stories together. And then of course, you get the advent of the AIDS crisis in 1981, and then things get dicey here.
Yeah. I think something that's really interesting there, maybe can we tease out the punk ethos? Like, what is the importance of punk in relation to like the histories of Chicano cultural production, but also what does punk really do that allows for that sort of in-betweenness, that ambivalence, that sort of negotiation of the here and now?
I find like, you know, well, one thing, if you listen to punk music, the first thing that probably stands out, especially if you hear it for the first time, is a sort of syncopated beat. And that syncopated beat, that something is off beat, is I felt very queer. And I defined queer after Eve Sedgwick, who says that queerness is movement, it's an ebb and flow, but it's also one that is anti-separatist and anti-assimilationist, like at the same time. And there was something about that syncopatedness that somehow formalized for me sonically, like what it would feel like to be anti-separatist and anti-assimilationist at the same time. And I liked the formulation of these two antis to be against as feeling really punk, of a sort of politics of refusal. And it relates, it relates to early theorizing in Chicano feminism when you look at not only Chela Sandoval's differential consciousness, which you could argue is pretty much the same thing in terms of like the punk ethos, but also Norma Alarcon's identity and difference. As she says in that essay, that there's something about Chicano consciousness that is like this naysaying, this constantly saying, no, 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 that's not it, that's not what I am, that's not all I am. And that sort of constant refusal I felt was very punk. It was, but at the same time, it was anti-separationist and anti-assimilationist too. But I also know that punk culture can be controversial too, and that's also explored in the book. But so there's no utopia offered here too, because the whole point of the book is not to offer you some sort of like solution. It's kind of a story of like, this is why we can't have nice things, but we should keep trying, is the conceit of the argument. But it's also very punk, in that way.
Yeah, that's sort of, I think that is really core to the sort of impulses that are traced in, say, queer utopia as well, where it's like, there is that sense of like the limit of what the utopia can sort of offer, like in the sort of uncritical reading that tends to be done of cruising utopia, where it's like, no, it's actually about the sort of limit of the present, while also that continued trying, I think is really important, because it's something that, I've dealt with in my own work. It's something that I've had a conversation with Karen about, where it's like, when we are faced with the violences of the world, what is the work that aesthetics and performance can do, and something that I continue to return to, and that I negotiate in my own mind, but also I still fully believe in the importance of the continue to try. And I think, and I continually return to the aesthetic and the performance as that capacity, because there's something really core there about the ability to try, particularly as queer Latinxes who endure a variety of intersectional violences. It's like the impulses to try is incredibly important to my own work. And I think that's really the sort of importance in that. But I think I also want to I want to ask you, like, what is the performance dimension of punk in that regard, like relative to exposing the limits of identity formation and the limits of what knowledge, capital K knowledge, can sort of beget?
No, that's really provocative, I think, for me, because the impetus to try is all stems from understanding that even when you are trying to, break the mold, do something new, challenge the status quo, a lot of these, or learn something like Latino Chicano studies or queer studies, you realize that like sometimes, that the world is rigged, like these things are all set up to fail, that identity knowledge fields like Chicano studies or queer studies are always going to be misunderstood, misapprehended, sort of we're constantly trying to legitimize our fields of studies or the objects that we want to do research on to people. And it's that sort of failure is already baked in, but that failure is also the very sort of impetus to keep trying. And so then there is this other dialectic between labor, like working, and play. And so it flips that, like, yes, you could see these as cultural actors who are, historical actors who are laboring to offer other forms of aesthetic language to articulate their own forms of dispossession or whatnot. But at the same time, it really turns on experimenting or playing with the things at hand, mostly because they were all working class or poor, and so you just kind of had to work with what you got, kind of vibes. And that playful involves imagination, and where there's imagination, there's also memory, and so that's how I define aesthetics, right? Like aesthetics is basically the tension between memory and imagination, and so. And what makes aesthetics only interesting is if it's political, and it's going to be political as long as you hold the body center stage, as it were. And that's what performance studies asks you to do. Performance studies asks you to look at, of course, a time and a place, but it asks you to also look at embodiment and the capacity for that body to affect and be affected by the world. And so that's, I find, a very no offense to literary studies or anything like that, but there is something about the relation between bodies in a time and place that is an interesting story for me to tell. Of course, not unrelated to a literary text, but different, it's different.
Yeah, I think that's so much of the importance of performance studies for me as well. And there is a way wherein that also really allows for a generative space around queerness, around Latinidad, and attunement to the body and the memory and the way that impacts cultural and aesthetic production. And I think also it generates really interesting readings in the book. I was really struck by the third chapter wherein you offer a reading of Gil Cuadros's work as well as of the collection Gay Latino Studies, and the sort of way that you take a literary text but also do a very performance studies based reading of them.
What does that mean?
It is really, I don't know, it feels not like it does not feel like close reading, but it feels like in the very most hegemonic sort of ways, it feels like it feels like a recognition of the ways wherein these cultural texts were produced as performing bodies in themselves that really feels different and interesting to say all of the really great work that's happening and that happens in Latinx literary analysis, but it feels, I don't know, reading it was the first time I came across a sort of way of reading in that way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I know it does make sense, and I can't wait till we open it up because I want to have that conversation too, because performance is an interdisciplinary field for one, but it involves the way that the book is not only structured, but in the objects that I talk about and how they are sort of assembled, as it were, or curated, or the way they accrete together. And for me, it's one text only makes sense if it's in relation to something else, right? And that I'm not trying to exhaust everything about ASCO, for example, the performance art group. Let me put this differently. You probably might be encountering this as you are starting to think about your dissertations or writing, right? You're like, okay, can I write on something new, right? Something that people have never written about. And so you're constantly looking for that rare thing because you want to be the first one to write about that thing. I didn't really have that with this book. I wanted to write about ASCO because people were writing about ASCO. And for me, one, I wanted to be in conversation with them, but also I never felt like I was going to exhaust everything about ASCO. It's just that I wanted to read ASCO in relation to other things that were also of my interest to the story that I wanted to tell. And in other words, the method creates the object. So we could be reading the same text, but if your method is different, it's not the same text, And so I knew that my method, which was performance studies, no one had written an ASCO from that way. And so, they wrote about it in art historical ways, they wrote about it in Chicano Studies ways, and even literary ways, but not through them as a body or a group of people creating art read next to the punk band X and their song Nausea, right? Asco means nausea in Spanish. Or Jean-Paul Sartre's novel by the same name of Nausea. And so already there, by bringing in X or Sartre, it becomes more than Chicano, right? Even though it's about Chicano. And that's also what I was really interested in doing, is that when things were curated together, it was about an identity, but yet it was also showing that it was more than that at the same time. That's what I wanted to capture.
Yeah, because that like play between the objects in the chapters is really interesting in terms of the groupings, because there is the periodization wherein it moves through the period rather chronologically, but also really like is grounded in an interesting sort of relation that is teased out, like the pairing of Sartre with Asco in really interesting ways as to sort of really speak to your own, the way that you're reading it is so interesting but also individualized, as you were speaking about, wherein it's this intervention by bringing a performance studies model to Asco, but also adding your own sort of interpretation to it that feels individual just by virtue of the pairings as well. I think is really interesting. Like, what other sort of pairings in the book did you sort of think about and drove like the groupings of the chapters?
Yeah, I mean, and when you say individual, I mean, what I hear is style, right? Like, or stylized. And, you know, that's also what I like to empower my students is like, you're developing a voice. This is why I worry about AI, but we could also talk about that in Q&A. But like, the thing about like writing and being willing to make mistakes and share things that are not completely done, or what, you know, like being vulnerable in the writing process and receiving feedback and criticism, all that is like a sort of refining, a chipping away at the stone to eventually have your own voice and feel comfortable expressing that voice. And so, which is your own way of style, like your style of writing, your style of thinking. And that's what I also really wanted to cultivate in the book, by virtue also of just the pairings of the objects. But to your question, like the book ends with Felix Gonzalez Torres, a Cuban-American artist, conceptual artist, queer, and died of AIDS. And Greg Araki, also LA, Asian American punk filmmaker, and they're not Chicano, right? Like, surprise. But as you move through the book, you kind of see where they fit in to a history of Chicano art and aesthetics. And that's also like, I couldn't start the book, and if you're imagining you're like a hardcore Chicano studies person, and be like, I'm actually going to talk about, you know, Chicano studies or some sort of like Chicano aesthetics and politics, by starting with Greg Araki or like, or you know, or Felix Gonzalez Torres. They're going to be like, what? That doesn't make sense. So, scholarship like is like politics. What I learned from undergrad, you meet people where they are. And then you have the argument that you want to make. You want to show them, like a good teacher, how to get there, and you walk them through. And so that's why the book is structured the way it is, because it should be read front to back, chronologically, because in reading it that way, you are, as a reader in performance studies, periodizing in real life. Like, as you read, you start to see how that period actually allows you to connect some, like the art of Gonzalez Torres or the films of Greg Araki, to the sort of political art that Asco was doing, that Alice Bagg was doing. And that, you know, takes some sort of, I don't know, care, I suppose, which to curate something shares the same root word as care, cura. So like this idea of being able to, what Eve Sedgwick called nonce taxonomy, be able to put things together for a little bit just to see a picture of it. I just wanted to cast a picture of a Latino studies that we could be doing too.
Yeah, I think that sort of assemblage, or I think in the conclusion you could call it portrait of a portrait. Yeah, that sort of assemblage of objects is also, it feels very inherently queer. It feels Latinx and speaks to the sort of way that we could, like the sort of queer feelings that drive Latinidad particularly, the sort of impulses that drive scholarship, but also allow for really generative critique in that it feels less, it's not prescriptive. It like has form, of course. It is stylized in that manner, but it also feels like it is able to move. It is able to follow the contours of both your own argument, your own style, the sort of feelings, memories, imaginaries, your own, that are sort of driving the argument in really important ways, but also allowing the reader to come along on that journey with you.
Yeah, and hopefully, but it's also very argumentative. Like someone read it and wrote something, and so our tenure. You could read your tenure letters at UCLA in the UC system because they're transparent, but you don't know who wrote them, right? But one letter writer said, it's very actually argumentative as a book. And that is in response to also in graduate school where I had a sort of well-meaning, unmarked woman professor, a racially unmarked woman professor, was just I had written this essay called Notes on the Come Down. And she was like, "Oh, you're an essayist. I think you should explore being an essayist. I don't think you need to write a book or whatever." And I took it. I think she was giving me a compliment, but I was also bothered by it because I was hearing that "Oh, you can't write a book. You can't sustain an argument for 4 chapters or whatnot. So stick to just writing pretty little things, you pretty little thing." And I was just no. And so that's why I was I'm going to make an argument that I could carry over for 4 chapters. And at the very end, because it was finished around 2020, 21, COVID, that moment. Things were really intense. People were canceling Latinidad, right? At that time, that was the whole thing, cancel Latinidad, Latinidad is anti-Black, that's one essay that comes up. So I knew I was writing a book about Latinidad and I had to account for that argument too. And so at the end of the book, I do, in a footnote, but mostly because that's not the way I also thought about Latinidad. To cancel something or censor something is to say that it actually exists. And the whole point is when you get to the end of the book, I argue, or concede rather, that there is no such thing as Latinidad, surprise, because it exists in our cultural imaginary, right? So it's about how we want to imagine it, and thus make an argument for it. And so the whole point of the book is just to say that it's a collection of gaps, dissonances, aporias, contradictions, things that will never sort of cohere into anything like an identity. In the irony in that argument is in canceling it, you actually make it into the very thing that you didn't want it to be. And so that is the trap that I didn't want to fall into.
Yeah, it forms it into something actionable that has to have some sort of materiality to it, or some sort of ontological sensibility in itself. In order to be canceled, there needs to be some sort of actuality behind it that moves beyond the imaginary in really interesting ways.
Yeah, I mean, because there's this idea of post-Fordism, right? Of we call it neoliberalism, or but what I was interested in was how social relations were being commodified and reified, and that was basically what was happening to Latinidad as a concept. Is when you start canceling it, you reify it, You make it into a thing. And when you do that, you actually are ignoring or obfuscating all the actual work and labor and play that historically it's contributed to, are even talking about it as sort of, contradictory, like a contradictory social phenomenon. So I didn't want to ignore all the sort of labor and play that at least these historical actors left us, so that we could sort of imagine something that, isn't so confining or binding.
Yeah, that makes sense, and I think that's something that's really interesting in speaking about the importance of the historical actors and what they generate through that, like, relationship between play and labor, I think is important. If we can shift a little bit, I wanted to ask, I think a question that would come up for folks who are reading the book for the first time is kind of, what is the relationship, or what is the role that, say, agency and resistance have to play in your theorization of dissatisfaction and the sort of ambivalence that's really core to the book? Like, what is because I think agency is one of those words that we use a lot in scholarship, but really has a lot of different definitions and manifestations.
Yeah, I mean, so I was really also influenced by Sian Nai's Ugly Feelings, and there she makes the argument that these ugly feelings that she was interested in were non-cathartic precisely because they were obstructing agency. And the thing about that book is, like, it is like a Marxist argument to say that, like, capitalism wants you to feel catharsis so that you actually don't have to, resist it, right? So when you go to see a Marvel movie and you get that narrative arc, and by the end there's all that. I actually never seen a Marvel movie. I did, like, I don't know. There's the big fight scene, and then, like, everything is
Marvel movies,
okay, yeah. And then you leave being like, yeah, the bad guy lost or something. Like, that feeling of catharsis, is what keeps you from actually going on the street and resisting or whatnot, right? That's what, like, a sort of Marxist. So the argument that Nai was saying is that, what if we look at non-cathartic feelings that actually are begat or come from the obstruction of agency, and see how they sort of distort or subvert the sort of politics, either of race or gender, that she was interested in. But I lost it. Oh my God, what was the question?
The role of agency and resistance.
I lost my agency. Like, where do I get that again? Yeah, I mean, it's also, again, 2020. So we were all going onto the streets, right? We were all sort of, it was a moment in which, like, because COVID, because this thing happened that we had never experienced in modern times, and there was no cure, if you remember, like, all that felt impossible. And so then, like, to find the cure, to go back to normal life, and somehow that impossibility allowed other things that seemed impossible seem possible, right? Like, working from home, or maybe even stop working, or, like, they froze student loan payments, like, maybe we'll get racial justice this time. Like, it was like, because of that impossibility of the virus, like, all the other things that we were told that were impossible became suddenly negotiable. And so it's so, when you talk about agency and resistance, it's those things are very dynamic, and they all move, like, it moves around depending on the social condition and history. And so I was just trying to offer an argument in which, like, it didn't have to look either or, but I was mostly interested in the middle range of agency, places, things that didn't seem like resistance per se, but might still, be subversive or weird, or not even meaningful in any way. And even that is kind of, okay, too. I don't know if that's helpful.
That is, because I think definitely sort of scholarly work that's been done around like minoritarian peoples, queer studies, Latinx studies, Black studies. I think there's a lot of sort of impulse to trace agency and resistance in really big ways a lot of times, particularly for those of us who are early in our careers starting out. I think there is a lot of self-imposed sort of like, I have to find something really big to speak about, that there's some sort of really big mode of agency or resistance happening, particularly in relation to like a pressure to create an original argument. I think that is a lot of sort of, that is something that a lot of grad students sometimes experience, but I think the sort of example you give around looking for like the small sort of moments of agency or resistance, even if they do not appear as such, I think is really insightful and offers a really important model.
Right, the minor, the everyday, I guess the book, if the book could talk and you raise that, you know, question of agency resistance, it would say, you know, why is that question important to you, Ethan? And like, I feel like that would be a better way of sort of, yeah. It's really not trying to prescribe anything. It really is just sort of a picture on how you could do something differently, and then do with that what you want, or figure out why that's meaningful for you. And I think that that's like, you know, as best as we can do sometimes. Is just recognize that like folks have their own sort of desires and obligations, and I'm interested, I would love to have that conversation, why graduate students feel like they need to make an argument about agency and resistance to seem original, but if everyone's doing that, then how original can that be?
Yeah.
Around those questions. If this book could talk, it would ask this question to you. I think it's important, because I also would add that sometimes I'm surprised by the questions that are brought to me, right?
Yeah.
By graduate students around certain issues. It's sort of like the agency, which I think we had that conversation too. You know, the desire for a kind of agential resistance framing. And you know, especially when I think, Josh, about what you were talking about in that weird moment of impossible possibility that, you know, the kind of, I always call it like the summer of racial reckoning. In the 2020 brought. And suddenly, you know, we were being asked to reevaluate, you know, statements on racial justice from English departments, which, you know, where that statement is like printed up and gathering dust in a conference room now, and none of the actions therein have been acted upon. In fact, it's much worse, right? Anyway, so it's sort of like, it is the kind of the cruel trick, the institutional cruel trick of the illusion of agency that we're often kind of grappling with.
Or fantasy.
Or fantasy, or it's fantasy, and it is like for a moment it can be real, right? But the performance is there.
Totally.
Then the performance maybe becomes captured and encapsulated only in this kind of limited moment. But thank you both for your conversation.
Oh, thank you. No, let's open it up.
We'd love to hear questions from the audience.
I was just thinking about this when you were talking about the comments that you got from the faculty member saying like you should be an essayist, and you're like, I'm not gonna do that. Just kind of, if you have any thoughts about like spite as an aspect, you know, how it's affected in like punk, Latino, because I think, and you know, pedestrian, but a lot of what I've been talking about with other Latinos recently is the Bad Bunny halftime performance. And there was something that felt very kind of like spiteful in celebrating this kind of like pan-Latin American consciousness in a moment where, you know, like our neighborhoods are being terrorized by ICE, that kind of stuff. And there's just, spite as affect.
Yeah, I don't, no, I'm down for spite as a fact. Mostly because usually I like playing with the in spite or despite. Someone's doing that in spite of something or despite them. I think it's always both. But, Munoz has this other really great line in Disidentifications, where he says, and this is what's great about performance studies, is that it's also a question about the audience, right? And so sometimes, people of color are not dancing because they're happy, but they dance because their feet are being shot at. And that's how I took that Bad Bunny performance. And so I'm like, for what audience was that for? And I know people really like Bad Bunny, but and that's okay. But I think if the book is interested in the minor, the everyday, the sort of uglier, sort of punky things, I felt like that was very hi-fi, well put together, lots of happy feelings, and yeah.
A bit of the Marvel movie effect.
Yeah, it's 100% Marvel movie. Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, I did cry.
At the Marvel movie or at Bad Bunny?
No, at that Bad Bunny, or not cried, but teared up. I was moved, right? But that's when I know they're getting me. I'm just then I get suspicious and paranoid, and I'm just they're just keeping me from actually realizing that this all sucks.
Yeah, I think when you toss Lady Gaga into something, it moves away from any sort of possibility of lo-fi-ness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't want to offend any Lady Gaga fans in the audience.
Or at least contemporary Lady Gaga.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Remembering that she starts off,
Yeah.
Yeah. NYU. No, but that spite is definitely, and you could trace spite as into a long genealogy of something like resentment and resentment, and being caught in that, what Sartre calls a baneful circuit of injury and recognition, injury recognition. So that would be the other thing about spite that I'd caution you for, is that it depends on a politics of recognition that you might not actually get.
Can I just say something about crying?
Yeah.
Because, my last book was all about crying, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah.
But to me, when you cry is not when it's impossible, but that's the provocation. Because I think that's sort of where you caught yourself, you're like, okay, I moved, and you're like, what?
Yeah.
And then you kind of harden against it, or you have some sort of reaction beyond, of course, that moment. Maybe it's an epiphanic moment, a little moment, the cathartic moment we're talking about, right? But then you're like, wait a minute. Unless that's it. I actually think most people stop and wonder what happens after you cry, right? And what that was about.
After being moved?
Instead of just surrendering to the thing that makes you cry.
Totally. No, I think that's absolutely right. And then you go back for more, too, right? So that's the other thing is, no, but I didn't cry, I teared up. I'm just kidding, but yeah.
Oh no, that was me.
Oh.
Maybe another question?
Literally about anything. I also know that I didn't go really deep into the book because I was trying to keep it very sort of trying to capture all your worries and concerns, keeping it open enough for you to feel a way in, and not this is specifically queer Latino punk, even though I know that's why we're in conversation, but also at the same time just show the breadth of how that conversation could go. So literally about anything.
I have a question, which is a comment. I just really appreciated what you said about that being a sort of living in the cultural imaginary, and that's why it's so fluid and ever-changing, it's so difficult to capture. I like living in that space, right? Because, undergrad, a lot of my exposure to Latinx studies and literature and culture was through a very Chicano framework. And then coming to grad school, yeah, like we've moved beyond so much of that, right? And because now we're at a place where like, yeah, Latin was canceled, Latino, Latina, Latinx. Now Latin is more of the term, right?
Yeah.
So like we moved way past Chicano as a terminology, and each carrying its own politics and aesthetics. And so, my work is very very hemispheric, very transnational. I often find difficulty with these terms because a lot of the research is also very local, right? Like I'm thinking about Mexicanidad, but maybe specifically in a town in Oaxaca, right? And suddenly these terms like Latinx, Latin, question mark, like they don't. I find it really difficult to enter that space. So I just wanted to say that I really appreciated that you said that. I find that I relate to that a lot, and I hope that scholarship continues to sort of wrestle with that in that way of like, not that it's not important to name these things or to consider what those containers can be and what they've done, like you said, but then what happens if we just kind of do away with it? Like, what does that also allow us to do, right? When we don't try to force, like, okay, that's a Latinx experience, that's not a Latinx experience, or that's a Latinx book, that's not a Latinx book. Like, what happens when we just kind of do away with that? So I just really appreciate that.
No, thank you. And I would say that like, it might be relatable if only because like when it comes down to like structuring an argument for yourself, it's always good to keep in mind the limit of your argument. And then what you could do there is actually pull that limit in and make it the actual ground for your argument. Like you always, like in spite of the limit, or despite of the limit, like this argument is, can still hold, right? Like, so, and I knew that, that the whole canceling Latinidad, that was all like, circling around. They were canceling Jose Munoz because he was saying, people were saying he's anti-black. Toxic positivity.
Did you hear that?
No, I never heard that one.
Cancel Jose for toxic positivity.
That's yeah.
Hilarious.
That's hilarious. No, I mean, or that he, was anti-black and I understand where those discourses are coming from. They're definitely like of a moment, right? Things are happening for people to have that as a discourse. But when you make an argument and speak to that moment, you could go back and read those essays and like, as ICE is invading like our neighborhoods or like arresting and deporting people, like whatever, the drama, the violence, and then to read something like, well, we need to also like cancel Latinos. It just doesn't hit in the same way, right? Like it feels like it doesn't help us really actually understand what we're going through right now, right? And I didn't want to make an argument that was like gonna like, I was hoping not to make an argument that was like too into speaking to the moment to the point where like it wouldn't age well. And part of that was trying to find the limit to that argument, because I do think the cancel Latinidad debate is fruitful, and it was fruitful and productive for me to the extent that it became the limit to this argument and then thus the ground, because the whole point of failing is to try. And so if I knew that like, that this argument was gonna fail for some folks, then I needed to make an argument for why we should keep trying to reimagine it then.
If I can ask a follow-up question, I guess, what sort of distinction would you make between a counter-argument and the limit to your own argument?
That's a good question. Well, I mean, like a counter-argument is just perhaps someone is presenting, like something antithetical to whatever you're claiming, and it doesn't have to necessarily prove a limit. It's just contra. A limit is the way your argument. It's what you could not account for, or what you can't foresee. Maybe it is also a contradiction to the argument itself, right? Like, I just saw a talk where this feminist technology person was making a case against like Western knowledges as being binaric and structured around binaries. But she was also a digital artist, like a digital media artist, and was making a case for the digital. And so then I just asked the question, like, But what do you think about like the fact that, you know, coding is binary of zeros and ones? That was invented in the Arab world, no less either. So like, where does that fit into your argument? And like, she couldn't, and I didn't mean it as a cat, like caught you, but it's like, that is a limit. It doesn't mean that she can't respond to that. In fact, she could easily respond to that by showing how it's about the glitch, or there's things between the zeros and ones, you know, like that's what I'm really interested in. But it's trying to anticipate those type of arguments and actually bring them to the fore as the very ground for your argument. I think that that's the way that people can relate it to their own sort of experiences or fields of research and these kind of things. I don't know if that makes sense.
That is helpful, because I think a lot of times we are taught in terms of how do you write an argument, especially a lengthy argument as found in like a dissertation or a manuscript. It's part of it is acknowledging counter arguments. So someone, you know, that inevitable reviewer too does not bring up that counter argument. But I think the limit to an argument, I think, is a different conversation that's worth sort of individualizing around our own arguments that we're making in our scholarship. That's really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Anyone?
Can I ask both of you a question about effort and style? Because you both spoke to trying, you know, there was this kind of peak moment where you were both like, yeah, like it's an occasion to try, or what have you. Style, as many have defined it, especially in a kind of literary context, so I'll you know, brag at that, is, you know, often framed around effortlessness. Right, so it's a sort of concealment of effort. Whereas the kind of punk that you're talking about, Josh, was a little more like about either the exertion, right, or sometimes even the opting out of the inertia, right, the exertion, inertia. I just wanted to invite you both to think about like how you would index effort along the axis of style. If style in its idealized form is in many respects about like, you know, the concealment of the effort behind it, right? Because that certainly doesn't apply to subcultural style or art style or what have you. And not to drag either, right? Or to a certain extent, or to musical theater, or to, you know, the kind of middlebrow art forms, right? Or like, you know, jazz hands, to anything of that sort that breaks the kind of composure of what's demanded. So yeah, I just wanted to invite that for each of you to kind of think through that, like where, so if we are to try politically, what does the depiction of the trying mean stylistically that, you know, registers the importance of the effort behind style?
Yeah, I think for me, there is I actually kind of want to push back on the supposed effortlessness in drag. I think there is a particular sort of drag, a very like what Munoz in Dissatisfaction called commercial drag, that is polished, mainstream, catered towards a very neoliberal, multicultural sensibility, the sort of RuPaul-ness that emerged during the early 90s and is now very dominant on Drag Race. But I think there are also streams of drag that very much linger in the sort of effortfulness, the sort of the uncomfortability, the lack of polish, if we acknowledge that polish or sanitation is very much a sort of neoliberal impulse that's meant to, especially around queer Latinx or queer people of color, like this impulse to sanitize. But I think the chapter that I'm currently writing focuses on the Boulet brothers' Dragula, and something that I'm seeing as I'm teasing out those aesthetics and performance is the lack of a very majoritarian polish, where the look that I'm currently examining has a queen using prosthetics as to zombify herself, but they're not good prosthetics. It's peeling, the fake blood is dripping all over her face. It's very clearly you can see the effortfulness that's going on into the makeup that's more apparent than, say, you go to a bar in West Hollywood and see yet another queen do a Beyonce number. I think there are particular strains around drag, at least, that are very much focused on the lack of polish, but also a recognition of effort. That the act of putting oneself in drag, it's hard, it's uncomfortable. There is a very clear amount of effort that sometimes gets kind of sanitized, but also sometimes allows the audience to really sit in the amount of effort, particularly if that effort is intentionally non-sanitized.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and that's a really great answer. I think about style sort of in relationship to history more so than to language, even though it obviously is about language, but it is this sort of tension between stability and change, and it does mark some sort of historical dynamic that's playing itself out. And I think what gets played out is this formalization of the insufficiency of the status quo. How that insufficiency that makes trying necessary, right? And so I was gonna read this part because, to be sure, ambivalence and malaise in this study do not evidence some ceding of agency, some romanticized surrender. No, they mark the need for better conceptions of political agency in the face of aggression, self-destruction, and catharsis. And so I think like effortlessness as a theory of style goes hand in hand with the insufficiency of the here and now, I think. And since it conceals work, in other words, it reifies like someone's identity, right? Like, oh, that was just who they are innately. They didn't have to try at anything. I think that is also a myth that capitalism shows us, is that there actually is no effort or work or labor, and in fact it's just sort of presented as if it's natural. And for me, anytime that anything is perceived as natural, there is an effort in forgetting, and in forgetting, then we are now talking about aesthetics. If we go back to the definition of aesthetics, of being the tension between memory and imagination. So that's like, I don't know how I guess I would respond to a literary person saying that thing. But that's how I would relate it back to sort of like a historical process. Yeah, anytime you see effortlessness, it's actually so much work behind the scenes.
Yes.
And not necessarily to their credit either. It's just like, there's just more work than what is being perceived. And I think the question of perception of like, why am I seeing it this way? Rather than who they are they hiding something from me? That is like, now we're talking about history and like relation between people too, which is, I think, a very important point.
I mean, that just reminds me of like what it means to be an academia sometimes, right? Like, being like a new, being a graduate student, like you often will see like the pretty side, like on the publication and like the full draft of the dissertation, and then now actually being in it, you're like getting to see some of the non-perfect or the non-linear ways that those final products get to be. But that's something about that a little bit too, right? Just a lot of things I'll say that way.
Yeah, it's abstract. Yeah, graduate school is completely abstract when you do it right.
I think on that really instructive note, well, please thank Ethan and Josh for their conversation. I would like to invite everyone to our next couple of events. First, there is actually a book talk with Ivan Ramos and Summer Kim Lee, who will be in conversation with Hentaya, in continuation kind of the themes we brought up in this discussion. That's on March 26th at 3 p.m. Taper Hall 420. And on April 22nd is our second intergenerational dialogue called Showing Our Work. It's the authors of a new volume called Embracing Queer and Trans Frameworks qualitative educational research, Sam Stiegler and LJ Slovin, in conversation with graduate students Kelso Bechtel and Max Lubbers. We also want to invite you to our final event, which is Alexis Pauline Gumbs, who will be delivering the 2026 Streisand Lecture on April 30th. All of this information can be found on the consortium pages, etc. Yeah, if any of you are interested in proposing scholars, authors for another intergenerational dialogue next cycle, please feel free to email me. We're going to put a call for proposals out at the end of this semester. So thank you all once again.
Thank you. Can I add something to that? Just like if you do come to the Yvonne Ramos and Summer Kim Lee talk, which I encourage you to do, us three wrote our dissertation / books around each other, and pay attention to how dissatisfaction, unbelonging, and spoiled are all related.
Exactly. I was reminded to invite people back. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.